一刷根39大林邦呀，当当当当啊巴扎呀扎呀。
So let's welcome David.
Hello, and it's a privilege to be speaking to you all from Melliodora, Hepburn Springs, about 120 kilometres northwest of Melbourne. So I will start the sharing of the presentation and get straight into it because, yes, time is tight. So in terms of context, where I am coming from here is Dja Dja Wurrung country. And like the rest of Australia, it was never ceded by the Indigenous people who were displaced and dispersed firstly by graziers in the 1840s, and from the 1850s by a surging population exploiting the world's richest gold region. So wool and gold contributed to Australia becoming by 1900 the richest country in the world per capita. My presence at IPCs has been erratic over the decades. IPC 1 in Australia, 1984, IPC 7 in Croatia. I was there, Wes, in 2005, and IPC 8 in Brazil in 2007, and some others more recently by Zoom. Back in 1993, I turned down an invitation to IPC 5 in Denmark because I couldn't see my way clear to spend at least 3 months in Europe. But the next year I did present at the European Permaculture Convergence as part of a 6-month teaching and study tour of Europe. In 2013, I wrote the essay, Why I Am Not Flying Much, to explain how permaculture ethics and design principles have informed my decision-making about travel, being more than just the current focus on greenhouse gas emissions.
David,
I support IPC and other national and bioregional permaculture gatherings because these events allow some of the diverse global permaculture community to gather in person and gain solidarity from and an audience of their peers. Most importantly, I hope this event will strengthen permaculture networks in Taiwan and what I believe is its important role as a cultural bridge in the flowering of permaculture in China through the tumultuous changes unfolding in the world. In this keynote, I want to use the Australian context to paint a picture of what a relocalised bioregional food system might look like following permaculture ethics and design principles. And in addition, I'd like to point to some other pathways and prospects for building resilience for rapidly changing futures. 2 months ago was the 50th anniversary of the start of my collaboration with Bill Mollison that led to permaculture. That was more than a decade before the sustainability concept emerged. In the early years, permaculture was mostly applied by individualist pioneers, commonly focused on self-reliance in rural environments. These pioneering individuals established some horticultural and architectural innovations in both household and intentional community settings. In Australia and many other countries, those projects were often started from scratch in unfamiliar territory on what planners and architects call greenfield sites. Those mostly rural projects were part of a larger wave of back to the land migration that was especially strong in Australia, New Zealand, and North America in the 1970s, but with earlier smaller waves in the 1930s and even in the 1890s. This counterflow to the predominant migration to cities over the last 250 years since industrialization is now even present in newly urbanizing countries such as China, where back to the villages migration already has a permaculture flavor from what I hear. Whether this counterflow develops into a flood will depend on energy futures that unfold. Energy descent futures will tend to accelerate this urban to rural migration. In differing contexts, that migration could involve greenfield sites and/or retrofitting of existing settlements. So since those early years, permaculture has grown and evolved into a worldwide movement across more than 100 countries with many different expressions and evolutions. One of those evolutions was the Transition Towns movement. Rob Hopkins, the founder of the movement, was a permaculture teacher and activist living the back to the land life at the Hollies community in rural Ireland. When he invited me and Richard Heinberg, amongst many others, to a community conference at Kinsale, the conception place of the Transition Towns. Transition took off with Rob's move to Totnes in southern England. In Britain, Australia, Japan and other countries, transition is mostly about community building and resilience in existing, mostly urban localities in response to looming threats of climate change, peak oil and economic contraction. It focuses on the people side of permaculture while often using projects in the built and biological fields to achieve those ends. Permaculture has influenced organizational networks designing and implementing systems with and by the most disadvantaged. In the Rust Belt cities of the industrial north, where loss of even the skills of poverty have created multi-generational disadvantage, addictions, and depression, despite the appearance of first world affluence and education. Many of these projects are strongly focused on mental and physical health, fostering community connection with any food or other production as a byproduct. This particular charity, started by Matt Willer, a school teacher who wanted to share his love of food gardening with the kids he was teaching. Even though I am not a supporter of institutional education in general, as a patron of this organisation, my name helps attract permaculture volunteers who see the opportunity for turning problems into solutions, including problem kids who don't fit into the educational straitjacket, and through such programs might make their own shift from dependent consumers to self-empowered producers. In the majority world, many traditional, rural and Indigenous communities are attempting to navigate the adverse impacts of both local environmental degradation and industrial modernity. For them, permaculture has provided a framework for reviving traditional knowledge in combination with novel species, technologies and designs that come through kindred global networks. Many of these projects were strongly focused on building local community capacity and enhancing the already substantial skill base of people to provide for themselves. The Chiquikwa project's success in Zimbabwe in transforming food security in the local administrative ward is one measure showing permaculture-informed food production can be more than symbolic, and that the non-monetary economy of self and collective reliance is as important as the conventional focus on development of monetary economies. For refugees forced to create new life in alien and marginal places, permaculture has in many cases provided low budget or informal pathways to how the obstacles and problems can become the solution. So retro-suburbia as a concept is built on the lessons of the permaculture pioneers, development and emergency aid projects, intentional communities, and transition towns to empower households in the long affluent countries to achieve their potential to live well now on less while building resilience in response to accelerating and compounding challenges. Households are often overlooked or taken for granted by activists and influencers focused on the tension between the individual on the one hand and the community on the other. I believe our small, isolated, and barely functioning households are the weakest link in the ability of long affluent societies to face difficult futures. Now, while most public discussion about the future remains obsessed with the individual and their identity networks and politics on the one hand, and the vast structures created by governments, corporations on the other, with an occasional nod to the concept of geographic community. Retro-suburbia is about creating diverse models of how our households can be the essential building blocks of relocalized economies and self-regulating geographic communities. So why suburbia? Suburbia is where a significant proportion in long and even recently affluent countries live, and is the territory where many have some knowledge and experience of gardening. An even higher proportion of children are raised in these lower density residential areas, so they set the pattern of early learning for the next generations. It's where a critical mass of people needed for community networks and economic exchange that we associate with cities is still possible. And there's enough available space, soil, and sunlight to grow food, raise small livestock, maintain workshops, and engage in other activities that sustain and maintain household and community economies. There's the ability to achieve scale of impact by replication of successful systems across neighbourhoods. So retrofitting the built, the biological, and the behavioural fields of existing habitation is a more realistic option for many people compared with the opportunities and timelines for greenfields design, which are contracting. Increasing regulation and rising costs for new projects are big incentives to go informal, and retrofitting existing properties can often be done under the radar of official regulation. So permaculture and offshoots such as transition towns and retro-suburbia differ from more mainstream sustainability concepts in many ways. The view of the future of permaculture is energy descent, whether by planned degrowth or breakdown, where a combination of resource depletion, environmental impacts, and other hazards of globalized industrial systems leads to a future of less resources and energy. Mainstream sustainability assumes a techno-stability, if not a techno-explosive future of material abundance based on renewable energy technology. The primary goal of permaculture is to build resilience to that assumed future more than trying to ameliorate the adverse impacts from a future of growth in material wealth and power. The primary strategy of permaculture is to rebuild localized parallel systems from the bottom up, starting with the self, more than to reform existing globalized systems from the top down. The processes used by permaculture are primarily self-organizing, practical, cultural, and even spiritual, more than policies, planning, and economics. there is a strong focus on biological and behavioral systems more than the built environment and technology. Now, of course, there are crossovers and complementarities between these different approaches, but these differences are important to keep in mind when considering the ambiguous relationship between permaculture and more mainstream sustainability. So the core and foundation of permaculture are the ethics of care of the earth, care of people, and fair share. In different ways, these were common to all traditional cultures of place, but are largely absent in societies dominated by globalized capitalism. The 12 design principles are thinking tools to allow us to adapt and hybridize the best of multiple traditions and modernity, while we discard the dangerous aspects of globalized industrial culture, which are progressively destroying well-being and nature. I believe these design principles will be most powerful in futures of less energy and resources, whether that comes about by design or necessity. So the most universal application of permaculture has been the redesign, retrofitting, and revaluing of garden farming, where householders provide a substantial proportion of their perishable food as part of the household and community non-monetary economy. Although garden farming is only one part of the permaculture vision, I believe its reinvigoration is fundamental to rebuilding diverse, resilient, and relocalized food systems, and that food growing, processing, distribution, sale, and cooking are the foundation for new localized monetary economies. So gardening to provide our food and other needs is a politically powerful act in modern affluent societies, where most people are totally dependent on earth-destroying ways of providing their daily needs. As well as food security in increasingly uncertain times, permaculture designed gardens using organic methods contribute to maintaining our health and that of the earth by conserving precious water, energy, and resources. Most important, permaculture designed gardens restore and nurture the life in the soil, which is a fundamental expression of our love of the earth and the foundation for future health and abundance. In Australia, the USA, and some other countries where most people live in low-density settlements, garden farming has the potential to supply a very significant proportion of the diet. In higher density residential areas, nearby allotments and community gardens in various forms can provide the same, but these are usually less productive than gardens surrounding separate low-density houses. This productivity difference informed the permaculture zoning concept, favouring an intimate integration of architecture and agriculture. My Retro Suburbia book and strategy reflects this context to energise the household and community non-monetary economies in Australia and similar countries with low-density residential living patterns. Published and printed in Australia in February 2018, the 600-page book has sold over 20,000 copies and has been accessed by thousands more through online formats, while the Retro Suburbia Facebook community has grown to over 24,000 members. Retro Suburbia is just one indicator of the resurgence of household and community non-monetary economies that happens in times of declining faith in centralised systems, contraction of monetary economies, and crises. Now, whether those crises are caused by natural or geopolitical forces, typical permaculture strategies are useful and do not require or depend on beliefs in peak oil, climate change, or evil world leaders as the causes of those crises. In this way, Retro Suburbia is more agnostic than evangelical, especially around the new, dare I say, religious faith in climate change as the most important and potent force shaping the future. So monetary transactions by corporations and governments dominate the globalized economy, especially all essential goods and services, while small businesses are mostly confined to discretionary, non-essential services. The corporation's stranglehold on the monetary economy was greatly accelerated by synchronized policies in response to COVID that forced closure of huge numbers of small businesses. However, the energetic, environmental, geopolitical, financial, and cultural polycrisis-driven transformations currently accelerating could radically shrink the size of the monetary economy. Now, past contractions in monetary economies through history suggest rapid growth in non-monetary and informal economies at the household and community level. Now, while these transformations already involve pain and suffering, they also offer unprecedented opportunities to recreate some degree of resilience and autonomy that almost all of our ancestors took for granted. So these non-monetary and informal ways of self and collective provision are also the foundation for new, localized, degrowth monetary economies, at least as much as could be achieved by attempting to reform existing monetary economies. I believe governments will continue to support and further subsidize large-scale globalized food systems dominated by corporations as energy descent crisis intensifies. This is one of the defining characteristics of my brown tech future scenario. However, this difficult context still provides opportunities to rapidly grow alternative systems in the shadows of the old, and that those complement any efforts to reform those globalized systems. Ironically, I see the Trump appointments of RFK Jr. and others in Health and Human Services, one of the largest and most powerful bureaucracies influencing policies in food and health worldwide, is the greatest opportunity for top-down reform in the last 50 years. So to those in the permaculture movement committed to reforming existing institutions in the USA, I say this is now the time to go for it. In this essay, I showed how what people do to create household-scale garden farming in low-density residential areas fits in and contributes to a larger vision of a bioregional food system. This vision applies the widely understood permaculture zoning tool at a bioregional scale. To ground this future scenario, I've used our local Melbourne bioregion, but permaculture designers, educators, and activists will know how to adapt this example to different contexts around the world. Around any denser urban or industrial centre, there's generally a lower density suburban area where various forms of garden and urban agriculture can make use of private and public space. In Australia, the older inner suburbs generally had larger gardens, while the outer suburbs built in the last 30 years, there is larger houses on smaller lots, but also generally more open public space. This significantly increases the opportunities for commercial and community urban agriculture relative to garden farming on residential lots. Beyond the urban fringe of most settlements, agriculture is the dominant land use, occupying more gently sloping and flat arable land. Further out, managed rangelands and forests occupy steeper and less fertile land, while reserves are predominantly on the steepest and most remote land. Rural fruit producing zones are much larger, but have lower yields per hectare, mostly managed by machines and animals. Urban food producing zones are smaller, but have higher yields mostly managed by people. So garden farming in the household and commercial community urban farming in the suburbs have comparative advantage in growing perishable, high input, high value horticultural and small livestock products. In Australia, these suburban systems could potentially supply the majority of these products. Broadacre farming in the rural hinterlands has comparative advantage in non-perishable, low input and lower yield extensive productions, such as grain and legume staples, larger livestock and some tree crops for commercial sale through local and central markets. The flow of produce to settlements from farmlands needs to be balanced by a return flow of surplus nutrients from towns to farms. So briefly, I'll just paint the picture of how those zones look like for a bioregional food system in our region, starting in the Zone 4 with the rangelands and forests, where maybe 60% of the total area could produce 20% of the diet. So these lowest fertility, steeper, semi-arid hinterlands that are not viable for farming or more intensive grazing, but will be important in any viable bioregional economy and energy descent futures, especially those involving severe climate change. Climate change could radically limit the scope of viable agriculture, while rangeland grazing, beekeeping, wild harvesting, hunting, and forestry for fuel, timber, eucalyptus oil, etc., from marginal lands are likely to be more resilient than agriculture. Water, soil, and biodiversity conservation are, of course, critical ecosystem service functions performed by these Zone 4 landscapes. And healthy hydrologies that sustain irrigated agriculture and human settlements may be the most important value from these watershed landscapes. In relocalized economies, the majority of the managed wildlands could be some sort of expanded commons managed by decentralized communities of interest that could include urban and suburban consumers. Within these natural but managed landscapes, there should always be ecological reference areas, special reserves, and sacred sites where observation and inspiration take place without imposing management objectives. This is how I have always interpreted the concept of Zone 5 in bioregional design. Zone 3 includes prime arable land that is mostly flat or gently sloping, with stone-free and moisture-holding soils suitable for cultivation without excessive risk of erosion and degradation. It can produce the majority of dryland staple grains, legumes, and oilseeds. The limited areas of prime arable land and the unstable climates of Australia suggest little, if any, of this land should be allocated to growing non-food crops. Soils with moderate to good rooting volume and fertility on moderate slopes that are less suited to annual field crops will be mostly growing broadacre tree crops, especially in our region, olives, carobs, nuts, and fruit for drying and or processing. The majority of farmland in Southern Australia is non-arable and only suited for unirrigated pastures and animal fodder tree crops. These same areas easily produce wool and other animal byproducts and are also suitable for timber plantations. Most of this production is likely to be commercial to support the needs of town and city residents. So within the suburban framework, commercial urban agriculture is likely to be concentrated in the lower density, newer outer suburbs built since the early 1990s, where there's much less growing space in private gardens, but ample public and private land, much of it in mown grass or eucalypt-dominated parklands of low amenity value. As well as intensive production of perishable veggies, urban agriculture on larger areas could produce staple crops, especially starch roots, pumpkins, corn, tree crops, and small-scale dairy. Another key opportunity of these outer suburbs is the larger roof areas of warehouses, light industrial areas, and shopping centres that could be used to supply irrigation water. So Zone 1, garden farming, in the low-density older suburbs with more modest houses that are featured in retro suburbia, are likely to be capable of producing much of the vegetables, fruit, and plant nursery stock, as well as small livestock products consumed by the residents. Unfortunately, two factors currently reduce the productive potential of garden farming in the suburbs. In the leafy middle-class suburbs, large evergreen non-food trees, especially eucalypts and conifers, prevent much in the way of food growing. Everywhere, ongoing infill development of larger houses and apartments covering soil and shading remaining garden space, driven by government policies and supported by most planners and many environmentalists. So any deflation of the Australian property bubble is likely to see an end to infill development, no matter how many migrants or other people are seeking housing in Australia. Of course, in these inner areas, attached solar greenhouses in the cool climates have the potential to produce seedlings and early produce while heating adjacent houses. This Melbourne case study from Retro Suburbia has demonstrated the productivity of small-scale permaculture designed garden farming. This table, published in the Retro Suburbia book, shows increasing yields from 1 day a week of gardening work. In recent years, the goal of 1/2 tonne of food from just over 100 square metres has been achieved. Here are some more current winter shots with the passive solar retrofit to the house visible, and the summer garden creating a green cooling jungle, but even more productive than the winter garden. Of course, this leaves the core areas of urban and industrial higher density areas. Cities have surplus water and nutrients, but space and sunlight are scarce. Aquaponics and mycology make best use of the built infrastructure and resources to produce high-value perishable vegetables, fish, mushrooms, and ferments. While some of this will be done in the household economy, technical complexity and capital investment required suggest most production will be commercial. Urban core areas will still generate surplus water for export to suburban agriculture, while surplus nutrients might be transported back to arable hinterlands. A substantial proportion of the food currently consumed in urban cores is actually by non-resident commuters, mostly as their lunches. In energy descent futures, a majority of commuters and shoppers will bring their own lunches with them, which will represent a substantial net import of food via the non-monetary economy, mostly from surrounding garden and urban agriculture. In Mediterranean climates of southern Australia, large evergreen trees, especially eucalypts, provide shade, wildlife habitat, and shelter, but compete with food gardens for light, water, and nutrients, increase risk in bushfires, and impede solar gain to buildings and photovoltaic panels. Creative reuse of many of these trees and replacement with more limited height and predominantly deciduous food-producing trees will be required if suburban and urban areas are to achieve their food-producing potential. Replanting of appropriate urban forests along highways with lower vehicle speeds and also on contaminated industrial areas can maintain urban forests for their benefits without the downsides of poor siting and design. So to summarise, urban and suburban landscapes occupying less than 12% of a bioregion might produce 50% of the value of food in the total bioregional diet. Rural farming on 30% of the land might produce 30% of the food value, with the remaining 20% coming from rangelands and forests. Now, it may appear that garden farming and urban agriculture could simply be doubled in size to produce a complete diet, allowing the majority of the land to be returned to wilderness. But this is not likely to be the case, especially in Australian landscapes and climates. Farm, rangeland and forest provide food and other space-demanding resources with much less human effort and less fossil fuel subsidy. These complementary foods are harder to produce at a small scale, while non-food products such as timber, fuel and fibres can be sustainably harvested without damaging essential ecological services. Active management of hinterland rangelands and forest with grazing animals and timber harvesting is actually essential to maintain fire-safe landscapes in Mediterranean climates like Southern Australia. In other bioregions, especially Japan and perhaps also Taiwan, where farming can be more intensive on well-defined, fertile, flat and well-watered agricultural land, the food from extensive Zone 4 mountain forests will be less important than the stabilising of whole watersheds against earthquake, typhoon and volcanic impacts. Thus, design against natural disaster is an important factor in permaculture everywhere. In retrosuburbia, we summarised the risks relevant to urban and urban fringe areas in our bioregion and more generally across Southern Australia and Tasmania. The main emphasis is on bushfire because it is the most common natural disaster threat, but also because bushfire resilient design is so complex, but also because the potential to radically reduce risk in design is so great compared with some other natural disasters. Many of the strategies relevant to one disaster are also relevant to other forms of both natural and human-caused disasters. While the elements of this vision remain embryonic in our bioregion and Australia more generally, I believe painting this picture is an essential contribution to its emergence. The essay Feeding Retrosuburbia from the Backyard to the Bioregion provides a more detailed exploration of this vision. But I would also like to briefly mention some other resources that may help others to expand their permaculture pathways to resilience. Over many decades, Helena Norberg-Hodge has provided the ethical and economic arguments and references for relocalisation and resistance to conventional development policies in both poor and rich countries. The kindred networks of her colleagues and collaborators around the world has many complementarities and crossovers with permaculture. I might say she has pestered me to participate in the international policy circles, including the UN. While I respect those who attempt to bring about those changes at that level, permaculture has, for me, been more about creating the world we want by living it each day. However, increasingly, my motivation is to use my reputation and role to acknowledge positive ideas and actions of others and add my perspective to further leverage those actions. This presentation with permaculture colleague Maureen Gamble and Brian von Hertzen, the visionary entrepreneur behind the Climate Foundation's Innovations in Seaweed Farming, is just one example. A paper to the peer-reviewed scientific journal One Earth by von Hertzen, myself and Scott Spillas of CSIRO is another step in getting recognition of permaculture as a framework to guide and govern the use and husbandry of oceanic resources around the world. Sébastien Marot is a teacher and architectural historian, one of the leading voices in the conceptualization of the design of rural environments. In his major exhibition, Architecture, Agriculture and Architecture, Taking the Countryside, he lays out the deep history of union between human habitation and farming. Moreau sees the rift between these two essential activities as the source of the environmental crisis, and tracks the efforts down the centuries and decades of modernity to heal that rift. He places permaculture at the center of these concepts and actions, especially because of its framing of the problem as one of design. This work from the French-speaking world is perhaps the most significant intellectual acknowledgement of the importance of permaculture, more than anything originating in the English-speaking world. He's also been the translator of many of my recent writings into French, including Future Scenarios. So from a senior intellectual conceptualizing permaculture to a younger boots and all permaculture activist, designer and teacher who perhaps burnt the candle of his passion at both ends and succumbed to depression and suicide in 2022. Dan Palmer was also an intellectual giant of our movement who became one of its strongest critics about its weakest link, the design process. In his blog, Making Permaculture Stronger, he certainly did that through a deep exploration of design process with both leading permaculture teachers, designers, and others in kindred networks who have influenced permaculture. In a few short years, he connected with and learnt from so many and did so much at different levels to advance and deepen permaculture design, teaching, and activism. You can read my Remembering Dan Palmer and all the other tributes on the internet, especially from close colleague Adam Grubb on the Very Edible Gardens website. One of the many projects Dan was juggling at the time of his death is this film, which had grown organically over nearly a decade from his initial excitement reading me, reading landscape, that led to several advanced permaculture design courses in 2017, 18 and 19. In the process, he managed to unearth aspects of reading landscape that I'd previously not been able to articulate. Dan recruited filmmaker Dave Marr in the long journey that led to this full-length documentary. Full credit to Dave Marr for working through the loss of Dan to bring this project to completion that can now be freely available resource for permaculture education everywhere. I believe it's on the program, a viewing of it. Also want to acknowledge another colleague who has collaborated with me over the last 25 years, Richard Telford, graphic designer turned permie who crafted the permaculture principles icons, published the long-running permaculture principles calendar, runs Melliodora Publishing and permaculture principles book distribution. Richard was the advocate and stalwart behind Melliodora Publishing support of Rosemary Morrow in transformation of her Earth User's Guide to Permaculture to become Earth Restorer's Guide to Permaculture, which is now in translation to Chinese language. Richard Telford and his family's Abdullah House in Seymour is another great case study in suburban scale, frugal abundance and resilience, where Richard also records their yields and new projects. In conclusion, I want to acknowledge that COVID and its discontents has opened up divides of understanding and action in the global permaculture community, just like the rest of society. COVID came in the later stages of creating ERG, and Ro and I found ourselves on opposite sides of that divide. By maintaining not just tolerance, but putting my money where my mouth is, we brought ERG to the world. I want to give a message of celebration of diversity of understanding and action in a challenging and rapidly changing world. In the aftermath of COVID, we took this picture, and our clothes are symbolic of the culture wars that are playing out in many long affluent countries. I see Retro Suburbia and Earth Restorers Guide as lighthouses, providing guidance in the fog of cultural wars. I imagine the light from Rose Book as blue, appealing especially to folks concerned about the state of the world and wanting to know how to help heal the earth and its diverse human and non-human inhabitants. Her perspective draws on experience around the world, and the book has recognition through the UN Sustainable Development Goals. By way of contrast, I imagine the light of Retro Suburbia as red, especially appealing to folks focused on getting their own house and household in order for challenging times. It is unashamedly local in its focus, and its demeanour is quietly dissident, without depending on any belief in peak oil or even climate change. My hope is that those outside the permaculture movement, in the fog of the culture wars, might be guided in by those respective lighthouses to the multicoloured universe that is permaculture. So this interpretation of this photo and these books may seem limited to the current cultural context of the USA after the return of Trump to the White House, but I believe it is emblematic of a larger role permaculture can play in recognition of truth and value in different perspectives, and in fact, different cultures, nations, and civilizations. I think it is not overstating the situation that permaculture can play a constructive role in the mutual recognition of both traditional and modern ideas as the historic geopolitical shifts underway only accelerate. In that process, we should always remain humble in any assertion of universal human characteristics, values, or even rights, while we freely articulate our values and beliefs. In the great colonial New Europes of North America and Australasia, we need to find a fruitful union between reviving of Indigenous culture and the rediscovery of our own cultures of place before enclosure and destruction centuries ago, as we let go of the hubris of Western world empire, which I believe is currently unraveling at breathtaking speed. But in letting go of colonial culture, demonizing people based on their beliefs, culture, let alone skin color or age, is counterproductive, even if it is motivated by the intention to correct historic wrongs. So the future of permaculture as a concept and a movement through this turbulent transformation remains uncertain. And all I can suggest is to see the truth in other perspectives, no matter how passionately we pursue our own. Consequently, I continue to support the rising tide of dissidents and victims of the globally coordinated COVID policies that I believe did so much harm to equity and health. But I accept that great differences in our movement over those issues remain. One minimalist perspective that might achieve widespread support is around the instinct to either flock for mutual protection or alternatively scatter in many directions that can, in different situations, be adaptive in dealing with novel threats, both real and imagined. As many permaculture event organisers have noted over the years, herding permies is like trying to do so with cats. So when the next novel event in this great unravelling arrives, my appeal to those inclined to flock is to also accept that lots of us are going to scatter, no matter how strong the criticism and punishments for doing so. So with that somewhat challenging message, I want to thank the organisers for providing this opportunity for me to contribute to this convergence, and I see from the breadth and depth of the program and participants, it promises to be fruitful for all present and hopefully accessible for those who could not attend in person. So best wishes from the beginning of Southern Hemisphere summer abundance at Melliodora.
一刷根30